I'm Marcia Moore, and on behalf of the Gateway Science Museum, I am delighted to welcome you to this, the third talk in our four-part Spring Museum Without Walls lecture series, continuing through next Wednesday night with this same virtual format. Before proceeding to tonight's presentation, I do want to thank our MWOW committee, our executive director, Adrian McGraw, and community board member, Dr. Rachel Teasdale. We also are extremely appreciative of all our speakers who are donating their time, talents, and knowledge to the furtherance of teaching and learning about science in our region and beyond. And we are grateful to North State Public Radio, who are co-sponsors of this series. And we do acknowledge and are mindful that CSU Chico stands on lands that were originally occupied by the first people of this area, the Mechoopda, and we recognize their distinctive spiritual relationship with this land and the waters that run through campus. We are humbled that our campus resides upon sacred lands that once sustained the Mechoopda people for centuries. This evening, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Christina Buck, who is the Assistant Director of the Butte County Department of Water and Resource Conservation. She has earned her BS, MS, and Ph.D. from UC Davis in hydrology and hydrologic sciences. She's worked on water issues in Butte County since 2005. In our first lecture of this series, we heard about groundwater and had an introduction to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Dr. Buck will share with us what is actually happening with SGMA in our backyard. And I love this quote from Dr. Buck at a prior presentation on water issues. She said, "You can't manage what you don't know." As before in this series, Dr. Buck will answer audience questions at the end of her talk, so please make use of the chat column for your questions, and Dr. Teasdale will pass them on to Dr. Buck. So Dr. Christina Buck.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be part of this very neat lecture series through the Gateway Science Center. And yeah, it's really, I love water and being part of this community and really trying to manage it for our communities and agricultural industry and the environmental resources that we know and love in our area too. So wish we could be together in person, but we'll make the most of this time together. And I know you received a great presentation from Eddie Teasdale a couple weeks ago, giving you really the backstory of how we got here to having the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act as legislation in California, and drought conditions and some pretty severe groundwater conditions that led to that. And so I'm gonna kind of zoom us into where we're at now with SGMA, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and what's going on in our area, in our region. So I'll just launch right in. Let me make sure I can advance. So I stole a couple slides from Eddie Teasdale because they were so great, and because just for consistency, perhaps if you were here a couple weeks ago, you'll recognize a couple of these. So since we're talking about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, we're talking about groundwater. So just an overview here, right? Groundwater is the water that fills those spaces between whether it's alluvium, which is sand, gravel, clay material, or whether it's filling cracks and fractures that occur in hard rock, volcanic, or granitic rock, right? Typically in the mountain areas or in the foothill areas. And so you have the alluvium in the valley, and then it transitions into that hard fractured rock system in the mountain and foothill areas. And so really the way that these systems work and can be monitored, measured, and therefore managed is really different as well. And so the Sustainable Management Act, Groundwater Management Act, really focuses on alluvial groundwater basins, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So reminder, another slide from Eddie on the act, just quick recap. It was passed in September 2014, and implementation began in January of 2015. And for the first time, it established a robust framework for management of groundwater resources in California. We've had kind of a system of water rights law in California for surface water, which is, diversions off of streams, rivers, creeks, that whole kind of surface water system, and pretty separately water law that deals with groundwater. And so this is a legislation for the first time that requires and builds this framework for managing it. So key component of that was recognizing that groundwater management in California is best accomplished locally. And so groundwater sustainability agencies needed to be established and really step up to do this work. And their first task is to develop these groundwater sustainability plans. And so a big recognition here is that this is not unlike the groundwater management plans that many agencies put into place 10 or 15 or more years ago. This is very much an active and regulatory program. There is a state backstop. If the locals essentially fail to sustainably manage groundwater resources, there's very specific process for the state to step in. So it also defines timeframes for accomplishing these goals. So that's the big picture of what we're talking about tonight, and how it's playing out here is what I'm going to describe. So again, a couple key deadlines. SGMA came into play in 2014. 2017 was the deadline for groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs, to step up and say, we're going to be the local agency that is implementing SGMA and developing these plans. So those agencies could be counties, irrigation districts, cities, reclamation districts, any local government agency that had water or land use authority. So pretty broad. And then in 2022 is our deadline for submitting a groundwater sustainability plan. So here we are in April of 2021. We are in the throes of really developing this plan. And so I'll get into that. And then 2022 to 2042, we have 20 years to achieve sustainability if we're not already sustainable. Some subbasins are in pretty good shape. Others have a long ways to go. And there are annual reporting requirements along the way, 5-year updates. So it really is the beginning of managing groundwater when we submit the plan, not the end. And that is something that we continue to remind ourselves. There's a lot of these things. We have to make decisions with imperfect information. We have to make decisions and really be prepared to adapt and make future decisions that may change, but we've got to start somewhere. And so 2022 is our deadline. So here's another slide from Eddie, and he talked about the basins and the subbasins throughout California. There's over 500 of them. In blue, you can see throughout California. And so tonight we're going to zoom in to the northern Sacramento Valley, and this is the Sutter Buttes here. I'm pointing to the Vina subbasin where we are here in Chico. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of lay of the land of this northern Sacramento Valley area, kind of north of the Sutter Buttes up to Red Bluff or so. And then the focus is going to be on the Vina subbasin, which is where we are here in Chico if we were together at the Gateway Science Museum. So subbasins in northern Sacramento Valley, here's a picture of those zooming in. Again, you're here in Chico if we were together. And there are a number of subbasins that make up the greater Sacramento groundwater subbasin. So that's the first thing to note. Groundwater is largely a connected resource throughout the valley, but we have these subbasins that have kind of carved up that larger basin, and these are kind of the management scale at which these plans are being developed and decisions are being made for projects and how sustainability is going to be defined and achieved. So that's kind of zooming in. The Sutter Buttes again are here, just to kind of ground you. Chico is here, and Red Bluff is up here somewhere. So lay of the land, this is a land use map, just to give you an idea. When you drive around our region, you probably see lots of rice. That's the pinkish color, lots of orchards, almonds, walnuts, some other pistachios, peaches, and then some riparian wetland, managed wetland areas, and also some citrus and other field crops and truck crops. But you can see that the landscape is dominated really by rice and orchards. So what fuels all of those irrigated agriculture is a mix of groundwater in some places, surface water in other places, and surface water again being diversions from the Sacramento River or Butte Creek or the Feather River, right? Water out of creeks and streams and rivers, or a mix. Some areas have access to surface water sometimes, and they can use groundwater other times, and so that's that mixed purple color. So you can see that the Vina Subbasin, which again is going to be our focus tonight, is largely groundwater dependent. It's mostly blue. There is a little bit of surface water that's available in some places, mostly here along the Butte Creek corridor and in the Durham area, but largely both Chico, drinking water is groundwater source, and most of agriculture is dependent on groundwater in the Vina Subbasin. And you can see that, you know, to the south, there's a lot more surface water. Some large irrigation districts, or a number of irrigation districts, use water from the Feather River, Sacramento River, and other sources to irrigate those lands. So still kind of at the regional view, this is a map that the Department of Water Resources creates, and they're really helpful for getting a sense of how groundwater levels change. So all of these black dots are locations of monitoring wells, and quarterly, so at least 4 times a year, someone goes out and puts a measuring tape down the well and measures the groundwater level in that well. And then from all of that data, they can create these maps to compare from one measurement to another measurement. And so this is looking back in time a little bit to give you an idea of how groundwater levels have changed since spring of 2004 to spring of 2020. So this is last year's map, last spring's map. They just did this monitoring about a month ago, so the maps aren't out yet. But you can see that we've got some declines in the Vina Subbasin. You can remember again that it's groundwater dependent. We see greater changes in groundwater levels both between years and within a year, right? When the irrigation season starts, groundwater levels tend to go down. And so in these groundwater dependent areas, there's more red and darker red. So we have some declines in Vina, south of Chico. The greatest number here is about 22 feet. Again, comparing conditions in 2020 compared to what the level was in 2004. I'm guessing that this big red spot on the west side of the valley is jumping out to you about southwest of Orland, and some relatively new irrigated ag went in there over the last 15 or 20 years, and they've seen declines on the order of it's more like 60, 65 feet in the same time period. So this is a helpful way to see kind of how conditions vary throughout the region. You can see as you move south, and remembering that surface water irrigated map in the surface water areas, both in Colusa Subbasin here on the west and in the Butte Subbasin, water levels are very shallow and also relatively stable and haven't changed very much over this time period at all. So just to give you an idea of variation in space, and these maps can kind of, I think, lead us to believe that, whoa, all the water is getting sucked right into that red hole there. And that's where this next map is really helpful to understand how water is moving. Groundwater isn't just sitting there, it is moving like a stream or a river that flows downhill. Groundwater also flows down gradient or downhill. From higher elevations to lower elevations. And so contour maps take that same well data, translate it into elevation, and helps us kind of like a topo map, topology map, helps us understand where the highs and lows are and what direction the groundwater is flowing. And so you can see here, kind of in that same area that was red on the previous slide, groundwater is flowing. That red arrow is pointing to the west. So there is some flow kind of toward that hole there, where the greatest declines have been, but it's not like the whole valley is flowing into that red, dark red spot from the previous map. You can see that generally water levels flow kind of north to south from from the northeast toward the Sacramento River. The Sacramento River flows right here. It's our boundary of our county, kind of right through the middle of this map. And so water is flowing, toward the Sacramento River from the east, and generally toward the Sacramento River from the west, and moving down into the Butte Basin, which is a large floodplain area right north of the Sutter Buttes. So contour maps are really helpful for understanding direction of groundwater flow and how it's moving through this regional aquifer system that we're all kind of connected to. So zooming in a little bit more from our northern Sacramento Valley area to the 3 subbasins in Butte County, we as staff, I am staff with the Butte County Department of Water and Resource Conservation, and we work with other groundwater sustainability agencies in these 3 subbasins on sustainable groundwater management plans and on implementing SGMA. So I'm going to focus today on Vina, but just know that if you happen to live or own property outside of Vina in the Butte Subbasin or Wyandotte Creek, we are also working with the agencies in those subbasins. So here's the Vina Subbasin. There's 2 agencies that are involved in groundwater management here, the Rock Creek Reclamation District, GSA, which you can see outlined in green, and the Vina GSA, which is actually a combination agency with representation from the city of Chico, Butte County, and Durham Irrigation District. And it has a board made up of a member from each of the councils or boards of those 3 agencies. And then it also has a domestic well owner representative on the board and an agricultural representative on the board. So a 5-member board is at the head of that agency. And then there's a stakeholder advisory committee as well, and those both meet monthly. So that's where a lot of this planning that I'll talk about is happening with those groups. So again, you are here, we're sitting here in Chico, kind of right in the middle of the Vina Subbasin. The northern boundary is the Butte-Tehama County boundary. The western boundary is the Sacramento River here. And then it swings around. M&T Ranch is here outside of the subbasin, and it follows the boundary of Western Canal Water District, and then up and essentially along the edge of the alluvial groundwater basin on the east side, as defined by the Department of Water Resources. So that's our kind of planning area, the subbasin that we're talking about. Okay, so this is a screenshot of a postcard that was mailed out a few weeks ago, and I know some have gotten it. Maybe you received this in the mail also, and you're wondering what this is about. So if you receive this postcard, it's because you own property or a parcel that is outside of an area that's served by a water purveyor. So outside of, say, Cal Water in Chico area or Durham Irrigation District that serves households in the Durham area. And so what we're really trying to target were folks that are probably groundwater dependent. If you're outside of one of those areas, perhaps you're dependent on a domestic well for your household drinking water, or perhaps you are you have a well that's irrigating agriculture or other pasture or land. So we're in kind of a key point in developing the groundwater sustainability plan in the Vina Subbasin, and we want folks to know that and to be aware of how they can be involved. And so if you got this postcard, we encourage you to sign up. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what's been going on with the Vina GSA, and then you can decide if you want to get more emails about it in the future. So another slide from Eddie here, there's a number of phases of GSP development, that's groundwater sustainability plan development and implementation, as I mentioned. So GSAs, the agencies that are in charge of this work, have been formed. And now we're here in GSP, groundwater sustainability plan preparation and submission. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this evening and let you know kind of how that's going. So here's the main kind of parts of the plan that are required by the law. The first part is just administrative information, who's the agency, where's the subbasin located, that kind of stuff. And then the basin setting is describes the characteristics of your subbasin. And so it has a couple of requirements: a hydrogeologic conceptual model, which basically is just your understanding of how water moves in and through your subbasin. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. What are the groundwater conditions in your subbasin, water budget, and do you have management areas or not? So that draft is available for the Vina Subbasin. It went through a 30-day public comment period back in August last year, and it's currently being revised. So it's able to be referenced, but is also subject to change. And right now, the red here shows the pieces that are currently being worked on and are coming very soon for public comment. We'll do a 30-day public comment on what's called the Sustainable Management Criteria chapter and the monitoring networks, and I'll describe those more. And then in order to achieve sustainability, we may need to do something, some sort of project, whether it's conservation or recharge or water supply projects, or just policies that help, protect well infrastructure. That chapter describes what the agency is going to do to achieve and get to sustainable conditions. So that's kind of the big picture, but step one is understanding our system, right? And that's really what the basin setting part of the plan is about, thinking about all of the different ways that water is moving and being used in the subbasin, on the ground, underground, the connection between streams and the groundwater. So the basin setting describes kind of the lay of the land in terms of how groundwater is moving. Really three systems: the land surface system, what's going on at the surface, what's going on in the groundwater system as well. Okay, so I think it's important to note that we're not starting from scratch. When we started working on the basin setting in 2018, actually, we really here in Butte County have a history of investing in understanding our water resources and wanting to protect them, right? Recognizing that the northern part of the state is where the water is, the southern part of the state is where the vast majority of the water demand is. And so wanting to protect and preserve water resources for the communities and environment and agricultural industry that we have here has been really important. And so we have a number of monitoring that's been going on for a long time. This is just a map of the monitoring wells throughout the Butte County area that have been monitored, some dating back to the 1940s and 50s. So some of these graphs have a long record of groundwater level data. And then there's just been a number of mostly grant supported studies to help us understand recharge dynamics or water budgets. So water budgets, Eddie had talked about too, is really your bank account of accounting for water inflows and outflows. And that's something that we had put together as part of this water inventory analysis report in 2016, which was well in the works before the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed. So really many of the activities that we've been doing for the last 20 years is how long our department's been a department with the county. We're now just kind of shifting to operate through the lens of and the framework of SGMA. But many of the activities preceded this law. So going back to kind of basin setting, the physical characteristics of the landscape. When we think about what's going on in the Vina Subbasin, we can think about irrigated agriculture, thinking back to that land use map that I had up there, lots of orchards, some rice, city of Chico, so an urban area there, rural residential areas like Durham, Nord, and then just other households. Major river on the western boundary there, the Sacramento River, other creeks and streams like Butte Creek, Big Chico Creek, and then riparian areas and ecosystems and recreational areas. So all of these things we want to characterize and understand, how they are interacting with the water system. So part of that is understanding historical changes also, and these are a couple maps that were included in a very recently released report by Land IQ called 20-Year Land and Water Use Change in Butte County and the Vina Subbasin from 1999 to 2019. And I think they're really telling, because you may have heard it said, that the irrigated land in Butte County is largely built out. We haven't seen vast expansion of irrigated area in our county in the last couple of decades. And that's certainly not true in other places, right? There's been a lot of growth of orchard areas in the San Joaquin Valley, in the southern Central Valley, and even in some of the surrounding counties. But this map shows in the red, so on the left is agriculture and on the right is the urban footprint. So relative change, the red is the reduction in agriculture. So areas that were agricultural land in 1999, but are no longer in 2019. And then the green is an increase in agricultural land. So areas that were not agricultural land in 1999, but now are in 2019. So you can see that it's very stable. There's a greater amount of red space than green space. So overall a reduction in agriculture, but we just don't see ag, really expanding. And so that's one thing, obviously that can drive increased water demand, increased groundwater pumping potentially. And it's largely not a dynamic that we've seen here in the Butte County subbasins historically. So that's the first kind of thing to note. So land use, a good portion of the Vina land use is native or unirrigated rangeland. About 42% is native area. About 13% is developed. So that's City of Chico and other just rural residential development. And then about 45% of the subbasin is agricultural. And as we've talked about, dominated by rice and orchards and then other crops. So the water supplies in Vina, as we saw on that map too, largely agricultural pumping is about 82% of the water supplies. Urban pumping makes up about 10%, and then there is some surface water that's used for ag, and that's about 8%. And you can see that it varies some, from year to year, depending on, really driven by wet year, dry year conditions in a lot of cases. So that's the first part of kind of basin characteristics is land use, water use, but what's the structure of the aquifer system? Now we want to start talking about geology. And so wells really are our peak kind of into the underground materials and what kind of layering of sand and gravels and clays there are and how that varies across the landscape. This is just a map down here in the corner of the geologic formations at the surface. And then we've done some special studies too to better understand the geology and the hydrogeology. How is the water moving through the geologic materials? And then you can use that information as well to create geologic cross sections to help us try to picture what the subsurface or what the underground looks like and how that then affects how water moves through it. So this is a map. This helicopter is over here because we did a airborne electromagnetic survey as a pilot program working with Stanford. And this helicopter basically flew these flight lines that are on the map here in orange and collected data, essentially taking kind of an MRI of the subsurface along those flight lines. And so from that, we can look and get an idea of what types of materials there are at different depths. And so what you're looking at here, this very colorful image on the right, is along this flight line that goes from the east to the west on the map on the left here. You can see that the pinker colors, reds and pinks, are coarse grain materials. So those are your sands, your gravel, that's your aquifer material. Water moves through that more easily, and that's what's productive. When you have a well, the well is drawing water from those aquifer materials. And then the darker blues are high probability of clays. So this helps give us a picture of what the structure of the aquifer system is. Does it have lots of clay? Does it have lots of sand? Are there layers we see as we move? So we're moving basically from the foothills over here on the right to the west. So if you were trotting across the landscape, you'd run into Highway 99 right around here, and then you'd keep going and you'd run into the midway. And so right around the midway, you can see that this thicker blue clay dominated kind of package comes into play. So all of this, the characteristics of the materials underground really affect our interpretation and our understanding of the groundwater conditions in different areas, why water levels change, maybe more in some areas than in others, why wells maybe encounter problems in some areas than others. The whole system is saturated with groundwater, right? If you dig a hole, it's going to start filling up with water. That's the water table. And under that, it's all filled with groundwater. But how it responds to pumping or how wells kind of intercept that, having cross sections like this can help us understand and better interpret kind of the water conditions that we see in wells. And so that leads us to this is a map of these monitoring well locations again. And these are graphs that show over time what was the water level in that well. And so just, I know these are small, just to give you kind of an idea, generally water levels are pretty stable, but in the last 20 years, this one probably shows it the best. This has data going back to the almost 1960. Pretty stable. What happened, one thing to note is we started measuring summer levels in the 90s. And so that's why you see bigger swings because we're catching those lowest levels in the summer months since the 90s, which we didn't measure the summer months before that. It was only spring and fall. So that's one thing. But generally, the last 20 years, you start to see this downward decline. This is in kind of the north of Chico area. Then in the Chico area, some similarities, some declines in more recent years, but generally, if you've seen graphs from some other parts of the state, these are moderate declines compared to 100 or 200 foot declines that other places are dealing with. That really instigated the passing of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We're looking at more kind of in our worst case areas, which is down here in south of Chico in the Durham area. We're looking at declines on the order of 20 or 30 feet. During drought years like this year, water levels go down. And then during wet years, we see water levels come up. But you can see like in this well that has a long period of record, even though they came up in wet years. So this was a wet year around 2006, 2011, but overall this longer term decline over the last 20 years. And so although we can say we're not as bad off as a lot of parts of the state, we still have some work to do. And our job is to deal with what we have here in the Vina Subbasin. And so there are some declines that need to be addressed. So just want to think a little bit about how water gets into the Vina Subbasin, right? Recharge can come from precipitation or applied water, creeks and streams, or subsurface groundwater flow, right? We looked at that contour map that showed water kind of regionally moving. So water is moving into the Vina Subbasin. It's also moving out of the Vina Subbasin as it passes through. So I'm going to skip a little bit so that we can get to some later stuff. So part of the required part of the plan is to quantify this stuff, to put numbers to these inflows and outflows. And so this is just a snapshot of the historical water budget. A couple things to note here. Groundwater pumping is on the order of about 240,000 acre feet, largely agricultural, and then some for urban, that's mostly Chico there, and some for managed wetlands. We do have, some significant subsurface inflows. So that's inflows from our neighboring subbasins, whether from the east and the foothills or from the north and south. And then some significant outflows as well, like from the Vina Subbasin to the south, which is to the Butte Subbasin. So one of the things that drives, change is hydrologic variability, and we see big swings in wet years and dry years in California. This is the last 50 years or so, going back to 1970, where we had a pretty severe drought in the 76, 77, in the 90s. Again, most recently the 2014, 2015, which was really a 2013 to 16 drought. And now it looks like we're headed into the second year of pretty severe drought. So, we see these wet year, dry year cycles. And like I said, those wet years help our water levels come up a little bit. But so far, over the last 20 years, we haven't had enough wet years to compensate for the declines that we've seen and the demand that there is on the basin. So this is a graph of of groundwater pumping, and you can see in the blue just how it swings. I'm sorry, the blue is change in storage. So in wet years, the water levels go up and the amount of water in storage in the groundwater system goes up, and in dry years it goes down. And this dotted line is the cumulative change in storage. So overall, we've seen water levels go down, which means we've also seen groundwater storage decline. And that's been happening over the last 18 or 20 years on the order of about 20,000 acre feet per year. So that's one metric for kind of understanding how out of balance are we. So that's kind of the piece about understanding the historical context, the lay of the land. That's the basin setting, the geology, the hydrogeology. The second big step in the planning process is defining sustainability. And I think that's one of the biggest questions that always comes up when you start talking about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It's that question, what's sustainability? How do you define what sustainable groundwater management is? And so this is the chapter that does that. And it's made up of a couple components: the sustainability goal, which is an overall statement about what it means to have, sustainable conditions in the subbasin. But then it's made up of some very quantitative pieces, and I'll talk about these, but it's really about measuring conditions, establishing thresholds that define when conditions are not sustainable. So when bad things happen, that's essentially your undesirable results, and making sure then that what your measured conditions are above or better than those thresholds that you said significant and unreasonable things, undesirable results occur when those thresholds are crossed. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. One of the things that the law does is it defines these sustainability indicators. It recognizes that groundwater has a number of components to it, right? Water levels matter because of wells. If the water level in the well drops too much, then there's well infrastructure, water supply reliability problems for drinking or for irrigation. But it also matters for just overall storage. In some places, right, if you're pumping way more out than is coming in, then you're eventually going to exhaust that resource. So not only do we want to pay attention to levels, we also want to pay attention to storage. In coastal areas, we also need to pay attention to seawater intrusion. If you're over pumping, you can pull that salt water into your freshwater basin. It's X'd out here because we're too far from the Pacific Ocean for that to be a problem for us. So we really have to focus on these other 5. But not only storage matters, but water quality matters, right? So we need to be paying attention to that. There's impacts from land subsidence, and Eddie kind of described each of these, I think, a couple weeks ago. And land subsidence is the settling or sinking of the land surface because of it can be due to overpumping. So you have large declines in groundwater levels, and the clays in the aquifer system compact, and your land surface actually sinks. So that can cause, here it shows that picture of the canal, so some infrastructure damage. And then finally, depletion of interconnected streams. And this is recognizing that groundwater isn't isolated from our surface water systems. In some places, our streams and creeks are connected to the groundwater, which means that when, if the groundwater is high enough, it's actually flowing from the underground groundwater system into the stream and contributing to stream flow. And at other times, or maybe in other places, the stream is providing recharge or inflow from the stream into the groundwater system. So we need to be paying attention to that connection. So each of these, basically, we need to measure something to be able to monitor what's going on with this category. So whether it's groundwater elevation or the total volume for storage or water quality, there needs to be a metric that is measured. So I'm going to give you an overview for each of these 5 that are relevant to the Vina Subbasin, where the thinking is on this. So the chapter that describes the details of how this is kind of sorting out is coming to you soon for public comment. But I want to let you know just kind of what's driving kind of the decision making at this point. So first, for lowering of groundwater levels, we essentially have down here a map of monitoring wells. So those are the wells that are going to receive kind of a minimum threshold and these thresholds that become our targets either for where we want water levels to be or where we don't want water levels to go below. And one of the things that we're paying attention to is, impacts to dewatering domestic wells, recognizing that domestic wells tend to be shallower than the irrigation wells. And so if we start seeing problems with domestic wells, we want to manage to avoid that. Also, increased pumping costs and impacts, recognizing potential impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems. And that's kind of like a new thing that term is new from SGMA, but it's really recognizing that there are lots of plants and ecosystems that also rely on shallow groundwater conditions and maybe tap into that as a water supply. And so that also needs to be paid attention to. And so some of the pieces of information that we have are information about domestic wells that are out there. It's not a great source of database in terms of really being highly accurate or highly precise, but it's what we have. And so that's just an example of, we have to do the best we can with what we have and then map out a way to improve the information that we need over time. So this is lowering of groundwater levels. And the focus really has been on setting thresholds to be protective of domestic wells. And so this is how it kind of plays out. If you have a graph for your monitoring well, you measure, these are the triangles are like measured groundwater levels. Your measurable objective is really where you want those levels to be generally over time, recognizing that there's going to be some variation, especially in wet years and dry years. But this minimum threshold is the level at which bad things start happening. So that's where we're looking to the domestic wells to say, what level would be protective of the domestic wells that are out there. When it comes to storage and land subsidence, both of these are tied pretty closely to groundwater level conditions. So we can kind of hang our hat on that and say, if we're managing groundwater levels so that they're not declining, just continuously over time, then we're also being protective of groundwater storage, and we expect to avoid land subsidence. So those are kind of a package, those three together. And then water quality, there's a lot of different water quality programs out there, from contaminants, nitrates, all kinds of different water quality problems. SGMA really focuses on, what the GSA can do to manage groundwater. And I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes so that we have time for questions. And so the focus here is looking at adverse impacts to, recognizing that there's saltier water underneath the freshwater system. And if we overpump the freshwater aquifer, we can actually draw up that saltier water that's underneath. And so that's what this monitoring is really looking for. We have really good water quality in the Vina Subbasin. Our department's been measuring for this for over 15 years, I think. We're going to switch the network and make some improvements under this plan, but generally we're in good shape here. And the last one is this depletion of interconnected streams. Again, just recognizing that groundwater pumping or other things going on in the groundwater system can affect stream flow and vice versa. So this is a tricky one because in many cases, and it's true in the Vina Subbasin, we don't really have the data that we need to have a really good handle on this. This is a map of output from the Butte Basin groundwater model, which is basically a big mathematical number cruncher that we're using to estimate our water budget numbers. And it's suggesting that largely these are the creeks and streams. Here's Big Chico Creek that goes through Chico, Sacramento River, and then some of the other creeks and streams. Largely, it looks like especially kind of on the eastern side, these are losing streams, which means they're largely not connected to kind of the main groundwater system. But there's more work to be done here. And actually next week, this is a perfect primer for Jeff Davids, who's going to be with you next week, and talk some more about the measuring and monitoring that they've done on Big Chico Creek, which is hugely valuable to the work that really the types of data that we need to get a better handle on being able to manage and measure stream and groundwater interaction. So just want to say again, 30-day public comment period is coming soon on this chapter. And really, this chapter is laden with management decisions. what are the community values? What are we trying to protect? What groundwater conditions do we want to see or not see? And that's all of that is defined in this chapter. So if those are things that you care about, I encourage you to sign up for our notifications and check out this chapter when it comes out, because that's mostly where we're at in this process. So again, describing basin conditions, shared with you tonight, kind of lay of the land of the Vina Subbasin, where we have some work to do, where things look pretty good. Defining basin sustainability, that's what we're doing right now, and that's coming soon. Meanwhile, we're also accepting project ideas, and there's a deadline of April 30th. So whether that's conservation or recharge, or how are we going to kind of right the ship and straighten out that decline in groundwater levels that we've seen over the last 20 years. And then ultimately, we're pushing toward adopting this plan by January of 2022. So I'm going to leave it there and open up for questions. I think just a main take home of Sigma is really that it's demonstrated, sustainability is demonstrated by avoiding undesirable results or bad things related to each one of these 6 sustainability indicators. And so how that's defined is a local decision. And that's where, you know, the Vina GSA board and the stakeholder advisory committee is really in the throes of working through a lot of technical data, but also working through the decision making of what do we want sustainability and groundwater conditions to look like in the Vina Subbasin. So I'll leave it there and welcome questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina. This has been really fascinating, and how interesting that this is happening literally not in our backyard, but under our feet.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all this with us. And as a geologist, I have to comment how exciting it is to see such an array of maps being used to help explain what's going on. So I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat that are related to ways people can be involved. So a couple of questions are, who are you accepting ideas from, with the previous slide where, you know, ideas for projects, and also who can comment and how can people get information about when comment periods are happening and that kind of thing.
Yeah, great question. And I think this was one of my main kind of hopes for this is this piece of information. So if you're interested, I want to highlight on this slide down here at the bottom to sign up for notifications, draft documents, and announcements. You can visit the website. This is the vinagsa.org website specific to Vina, or you can text BC Water and we'll add you to our Sigma notification list, and you'll start getting notifications about these meetings. And certainly when that draft chapter comes out and the 30-day comment period opens, you would get an email notification about that. So these are the 3 websites for those 3 Butte County subbasins. All of the information that's already been developed for these plans is there, and that's where future work will be posted as well. And your first question was?
What kind of projects are you looking for, and who can propose those? And
yeah, so anyone can propose those. There are quite a few requirements for what for the project to be in the plan, included in the plan. There's quite a few requirements for kind of what you have to know about the project. But at this point, we have kind of a Google form, project submittal form on the Vina GSA website. And I encourage anyone can use that form to submit concept level projects, you know, planned projects, or whether it's really a developed project or really if it's just an idea. We're kind of in the gathering stage, so anyone can do that. And as far as the comment period, same thing. Anyone, we welcome any comments from the public.
Great. So one specific question about recharge that has come up is whether the AEM data can be used to identify potential recharge zones, or are there ways that are known for enhancing recharge zones? Are there projects that could do that, or can you tell us just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's a few different maps out there and work that's been done to try to identify, you know, areas that might be good for recharge. And I think the AEM data set can certainly be part of that in the future as well. With a lot of things, it's just kind of there's so much information and data there that was collected, from that helicopter flight. And we've worked with Dr. Todd Green, who's really been our boots on the ground local geologist to help interpret that data, which is critical for success of really utilizing the geophysical data. And so, yeah, you get some information. It's important always to recognize kind of the limitations of the data that you've collected, but it gets blurrier as you get deeper. So yeah, you can use the data, in the shallower zones to understand and get an idea of what areas might be more or less conducive to recharge. We haven't really dived into that as far as, with that data set as much as I think we could. But that's a resource that could be done in the future as part of kind of a general project of recharge flood MAR, which is flood managed aquifer recharge, using flood waters and trying to slow them down and give them time to get into the groundwater system. And so, yeah, I think AEM or other maps out there related to soils and geology should all be part of kind of the puzzles that are used to try to identify recharge areas.
Great. Okay. So another question that has come up is thinking ahead to the implementation part of the plan, or beyond the plan, I guess, and into the implementation stages. There's obviously a lot of work that's going into this, and it looks like it's going to continue for the next few decades. How is some of this funded? If there are costs associated with future work and maintenance and implementation, what's the cost planning look like for that?
Yeah, good question. So right now, the development of this plan is grant funded. So we've received a Proposition 1 groundwater sustainability planning grant to do the plans in these 3 subbasins, and our department is managing that project. But you're right. I mean, all these things, whether we need additional monitoring or projects, all of those things are going to cost money. There is Proposition 68, which has grant funding for implementation of GSPs, of groundwater sustainability plans. And so I think there's like $2 to $5 million per subbasin potential grant funding. So we certainly will be going after, that for work in these subbasins. But we're just starting to really have that conversation with the Vina GSA board and recognizing, that there's some ongoing agency costs, of just being an agency, whether it's the structure of the Vina GSA is that it would not have any employees of its own. So right now it's in-kind staff work from the city of Chico, from Butte County and Durham Irrigation District that are kind of running the staff side of things. But, managing projects or managing those grants in the future, that may have cost associated with it. So there's potential for, raising fees or, that's very much the next big hard conversation that's going to start to happen at the Vina GSA board and with the advisory committee. So I think a mix of grant funding and then potential funding the agency as well locally.
I see. And will those conversations have opportunities for public involvement and comment and input?
Yeah. So the Vina GSA board meets monthly. It's a public Brown Act. They've been meeting on Zoom the last year. So yeah, any and all are welcome. Same thing, all that information is available on the vinagsa.org website, as is the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. They meet monthly as well, and that's also Zoom and open to the public.
Great, lots of ways to get involved. That's wonderful.
We can keep you on Zoom a lot.
Even more than already. So there are a couple more questions about some of the projects associated with the plan. One question is addresses this idea of infiltration. As it turns out, the parking lot at Gateway is made of porous material to allow water to infiltrate. Are those kinds of projects that that might make a difference widely in the Vina subbasin, or?
Yeah, that's a great example. I think there's there are many planning processes, right? The city of Chico has a stormwater resources plan. There's the integrated regional water management plans, there's flood plans, there's now a groundwater sustainability plan. All of these plans typically have project lists. And so one of the things that Kelly in our office is doing is some outreach and just phone calls and emails to these other agencies that have these plans and saying, hey, do you have any projects kind of on a list already somewhere that has potential groundwater benefit, and should be included in this groundwater sustainability plan, because then it becomes eligible for funding. So if you have a project that's on multiple planning lists, with multiple multi-benefit projects are going to be, more competitive for grant funding. So yeah, any of that type of project is what we want to capture.
Great. And last week we heard, and oftentimes we have students from Butte College and Chico State attend the MWOW lectures. And last week we had a really cool presentation about some student projects. I wonder if, do you know of any of those that are already involved, or it sounds like there's at least opportunity for those to be pitched?
Yeah, certainly. I don't know that I've seen them on the list. I think we had about 8 different projects submitted so far. But yeah, hopefully in the next 10 days, they'll start rolling in. So if you're a student or staff, or I know we've done some conversations, Kelly's had some conversations with folks at the center there at Chico State. Yeah, those are all good concepts and potential projects.
Great. More ways for folks to be involved. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So there's one question about monitoring groundwater levels. Somebody asks if it's possible to monitor groundwater levels with a well that is not in use. There's no water being pumped there now. Can that still be measured?
Yeah, great question. We have in the monitoring network, we actually have a mix of types of wells. So we have some household wells that folks for decades in some cases have allowed us to measure, but we typically want to measure a static groundwater level, which means that it's not pumping at the time that we measure the groundwater level. So so there's some domestic wells, household wells, there's some irrigation wells, and there's some dedicated monitoring wells that have been drilled for the sole purpose of measuring groundwater levels. And I know that some of the wells that are part of the network are abandoned, no longer used irrigation wells or other things. So yeah, it's important to have information on the depth of the well and the well log, which tells us information about where it's screened, what part of the aquifer it's talking to or receiving water from. But yeah, and I think in part of this whole process is going to shine light on where we need additional data and what those data gaps are. So we may come knocking on doors or go for grant money to put in new monitoring wells as well.
Great. Okay. Well, this is great. I see several comments in the chat thanking you for such a wonderful presentation, and I'd like to express that as well. And I think Marcia or Adrian are going to take us out. But thank you, Christina, again for this wonderful presentation and all your time and expertise. We sure appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And I will add my thanks to you. Very clear and so exciting to hear about it before and as it's happening rather than a report after the fact, because it's such an important topic. And also, I will repeat what you said about next week. Dr. Jeff Davids will be here. He's a relatively new professor in both civil engineering and agriculture, and he is going to bring to us some important information on monitoring studies that he's done in Nepal. So definitely plan to come, tell your friends. We'll look forward to seeing you next Wednesday night. And thanks again, Christina. That was superb.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.